and this is Changing the Narrative. I'm David Rives, and we are changing the narrative every week on the podcast because we've been spoon-fed this narrative that, hey, everything around you just happened by chance, that we're not really here for any purpose. But when we look outside, when we step on every blade of grass, when we actually go for a hike and we look around us, we see this creation that is finely tuned. It's finely tuned not just to survive, but finely tuned to thrive. And that points back to a tuner. I believe that there is a grand designer who has created everything for a purpose. But I'm really excited because I am joined today by Creek Stewart in studio. Welcome.
Hey, thanks to be here. It's a privilege.
It is great to have you here and your entire family at the Wonders Center. We really appreciate you making the trek down.
Yeah, they're out wrecking your museum right now.
There's plenty to do. In fact, I'm sure River's out there on the earthquake right now trying to break the building blocks down. And
yeah, I'm sure he is.
No, first, give me just a little insight, because as a wilderness survival expert, as someone who has been in this field for a long time, researching and sort of honing in, tell me about your background.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Boy Scouts.
Okay.
That's where I fell in love with the outdoors, really. And I went to college to be a pharmacist.
Wow.
Of all things, until I shadowed one.
Okay.
And then I saw my life flash before my eyes. And, I asked myself, what do I really enjoy doing? And I just really enjoyed being in the woods. I thought about my wilderness survival merit badge and Boy Scouts. And I actually taught my first wilderness survival training course when I was in college.
Wow.
And that's been over 25 years ago. And I guess, as they say, the rest is history. But I did spend about 15 years trying to figure out how in the world to make a living teaching wilderness survival skills. It's not your typical career path.
Right.
But it has certainly given me a unique view of creation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, a lot of people underestimate, right? You don't need it until you need it.
That's right.
And that's something where a lot of times, if we're stuck in a city or even a rural town, we don't think about these possibilities. We don't think, well, hey, I should be prepared for whatever might come. And so many people just brush it aside and they say, well, that's someone else. That will never be me, where I really want to get out there or need to know what I'm doing in the middle of the wilderness, in the woods, trying to survive on my own. But it is fascinating. And what I see, Creek, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like everything that I see in the woods as I walk through is this opportunity to either have a food supply or to have shelter or to have whatever it might be. And that's exciting. Yeah.
I always joke around that God was the original wild edible plant instructor. As he was walking Adam and Eve through the garden, you can eat this plant and this plant, but don't eat that one because it'll kill you, And what's the first thing God did when he kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden? Well, he made for them clothing out of hides. Yes. So I like to imagine that God was the first wilderness survival instructor too.
Wow.
So there wasn't a Home Depot, right? Back in the day, right? With Adam and Eve and first humans. And how did they toil in the field, and where did they get their rope and their tools and their shovels and all of those things that they needed to survive? Well, I believe that God has a grand design for everything. And I believe that he hardwired all of those things into the plants and animals and rocks and of creation. And I'm like you. When I walk through the woods, I don't see a plant, I see rope.
Right.
I don't see a rock, I see a knife. I don't see bones, I see tools. And so perspective is everything, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It is. And again, that seems to be the way God originally intended it. But we're so comfortable today that we're like, well, I could just go out and buy it. And so no need to learn how it could have originally functioned. Yeah. There are medicinal purposes for some of the plants that we see out in. Can you give me an example?
Well, I mean, there's just some of your backyard wild plants. Plantain, which is a backyard plant, or dandelion. They all have medicinal properties. Wow. So many. Stingy nettle is a plant that obviously some people brush up against when they're running through the woods, but have no idea that it's not only a wild edible, but it has medicinal properties as well. There are I would argue that there is no plant that is without use,
right,
in one way, shape, or form. I believe that all of them are very intentional.
Yes.
We just may not understand those uses today.
And again, so I lead African photo safaris to South Africa, and I'll be going through the bushveld, and I'll ask the local, I was like, what is this tree, Yeah. And he says, oh, that is the fever tree. That is the fever tree. And why is it called the fever tree? Well, if you take the leaves and you blow them down, they will reduce your fever.
Right.
That would be good to know.
Yeah.
That would be great to know that God has given us, even in an imperfect world, a sin-cursed world, he's given us everything we need.
That's right.
To survive.
That's right. I have a saying, it's not if, but when.
Yeah.
And I believe that's true, that we will all someday be faced with a sudden and unexpected survival scenario where the skills we have and the knowledge we know or have picked up along the way could make a difference in life or death. And so much of that is understanding how to find what you need using what you have.
Yes.
And there is always there are always resources in the wilderness.
Wow.
And so much of that knowledge has been lost over the years, especially in this day and age.
It has. Now, I understand that you've written 1 or 2 books.
Yeah, just a few. I think I'm over 40 at this point.
Wow.
But whether it's about wild edible plants or survival hacks or surviving wildfires and tornadoes, all of my books have been in the survival and disaster preparedness space. But that's my passion.
Yeah.
And I think that's how the Lord works, right? He aligns your passions eventually with a mission at some point.
Absolutely.
And so it's been an honor to learn and teach these skills and to eventually figure out that these things, my path as a wilderness survival instructor, that's not coincidental either.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit and talk about how you can blend the two, but it hasn't always come as a natural connection?
No, it hasn't. I spent my first 20 years just teaching wilderness survival skills. And you know how Jesus works, right? He comes in and he shakes your life up sometimes. And he certainly did that with me. A couple of really foundational events in my life. My marriage was falling apart and I kind of reached a rock bottom. We had a daughter pass away, which you can imagine shakes the foundation of any family and any marriage. And so those two events combined made me really, not only, thank the Lord that Jesus was the rock at the bottom.
Yes. But
they really made me evaluate my life and my career. And I remember kind of wrestling with the Lord in that time and saying, Lord, but I'm a wilderness survival instructor. What am I supposed to do with this to honor and glorify you? And
right.
I felt like he was joking with me in those moments and like, have you ever read the Bible? I love the wilderness, Yes. I mean, think about it, from Adam and Eve to Moses and the Israelites to Jesus himself. Every time, Jesus wanted to draw closer to the Lord, he went out into the wilderness for solitude. And so I think his answer was really simple to me. I want you to do exactly what I've prepared you to do, except now just put me in the front of it and use it to glorify me. And so that's what I've spent the past several years trying to do.
That is so neat. Okay, so you've been on TV many times as an expert sharing these tips and tricks with people.
Yeah.
But again, it's almost like everything that we need is there. And oftentimes we forget just how peaceful and serene it is to get out into nature and to take a step back. I can remember a few years ago, I went to the Grand Canyon and I spent 3 days in the Grand Canyon. Well, you don't get cell reception in the Grand Canyon, right? It's something where, okay, yes, I'm trying to run a ministry from afar on the road as I speak, as I do all of these things, but you have to take a step back and you have to leave the technology behind.
Yeah.
And there's something about a reset of really seeing how God originally intended it that brings you closer to an understanding that this is all here for a purpose, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I believe that God designed the wilderness as a place for us to draw closer to him, period. He could have put Adam and Eve in a palace of gold.
That's right.
In any kind of structure or building that he could imagine, but he didn't. He put them in a wild garden. And I think that was very intentional. And in today's day and age, we are really missing out on that. We are so connected and so distracted by modern society, whether it's the cell phone or whether it's just the hustle and bustle of city life, careers, and very few people seek solitude in the wilderness these days. And I always ask myself, if it was important to Jesus, it would be important to us. And even in the bustle, the busiest time of his ministry, he took that time to go into the quiet places.
Yes.
And we should really pay attention to that, because I believe that the Lord calls us into the wilderness to be free of distractions, to draw closer to him. And there's a special thing to be found there.
And Creek, I would say that if we go to the book of Genesis in the beginning, it gives us the dominion mandate. It's like, go out, subdue the world, all of this. Even from a very, very early age, God says to Adam, start naming these animals.
Right.
What does that mean? Well, first, Adam has to observe the animals.
Right.
He has to actually see their behavior.
Right.
And then he has to study that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's observation and study of the natural world.
Right.
Which leads to him wanting to better how he can explain the natural world around him by naming those animals so that he can refer to them in the future.
Yeah.
So even the dominion mandate is about getting out, studying. It's not about abusing God's creation. It is about using it for our advantage, whether it's a tree for shelter or whatever it might be.
Right.
But it's about having an awareness of our surroundings. And that's exciting.
It is very exciting. And I believe the more time spent studying and watching creation, the more you glean, the more you see and the more you understand that, man, there are so many. When you think about it, everything we see in this room right now, it all is derived from creation in one way, shape, or form.
That's right.
But you begin to see some of the basics of those elements by just sitting in the woods and staring at a tree that maybe has some fibers coming out of the bark. And you're like, wait a minute, that kind of looks like rope.
Yeah.
Or the edge of that rock kind of looks like it could cut something. And you start to see how God hardwired that stuff into creation. And it's incredible.
Yes.
This microphone's incredible, but the fact that all of the things that make this microphone are in creation itself is even more astounding.
The silicon in every computer chip that is making this broadcast possible.
Right.
The wood that makes up the acoustics.
Everything.
That traps the sound in this room. It's like every single thing.
Yeah.
And then the physics that make it all work.
Right.
Have to be so finely tuned so that the photons from the studio lights hit us at precisely the right way so that it bounces back. And then our eyes have to be able to take those photons in to interpret them to say, hey, there's Creek Stewart sitting there in that chair. Yes, I can see the shape of his face. I can see all of this. It's almost miraculous when you think about it. But at the same time, I really love the way you say that God was the first wild edible.
True, right?
Right. Okay. So when you go out, you see a mushroom on the ground.
Yeah.
You have to be able to identify that, and you're like, no, don't eat of that one because that one brings death. Right.
Yeah.
You can eat of this one and this one, just like God did.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I always joke about that in my courses. So, I just taught wilderness survival courses, but now I teach a course called Wild God Survival Course because God is wild.
Yes.
God loves the wilderness. He loves wilderness themes. He loves the fact that he hardwired all this stuff into creation for us to find like little Easter eggs, right? And so the survival courses I teach now are called Wild God Survival Courses, where we not only explore survival skills, but we explore that there is an amazing God that wove all of these cool things into creation just for us to find and use.
Yeah.
And it makes survival, at least for me, so much more meaningful and impactful because not only are you learning the skills, but you are really beginning to tap into the whole point of it all.
Absolutely. Okay. Did that come as difficult? I know that you had built up a really big following.
Yeah.
You've been on TV. You've written all of these books on the issue, but you it hasn't been more until recently that you've started to blend the faith perspective in.
That's right.
Has that been easy? Has it been hard? How's that gone?
It's not been easy because my business is a personality-driven business. So the face of my business is me, and as my life changes, my business changes.
Right.
And when Jesus came in and just kind of did a 360 in my life, naturally that eventually impacts my business.
Yeah.
And so my narrative began to change, my narrative as a wilderness survival instructor. A lot of the customers and fans who had followed me over the years, they're like, wait a minute. Jesus, Creek is just all of a sudden now talking about Jesus all the time, and so I've had to go through a shift, and I'm still navigating that, to be honest with you, where before I just kind of talked about wilderness survival skills and left it at that. But now I talk more about Jesus than I do wilderness survival skills these days. And I'm finding the members of my audience who appreciate that, and then I'm growing my audience in a new and different way.
Absolutely.
But it's in a much more meaningful and obviously kingdom-driven way. And I learned a long time ago that when Jesus comes in and like a survival situation, a rescue crew would never just partially rescue someone. Just to maybe rescue their arm, right?
Right.
Well, Jesus is the same way, He's not going to come in and just ask for my marriage.
Yeah.
He's not going to come in and just ask for my family. He wants it all. He wants my career. He wants everything. And so as I've surrendered those different parts of my life, it's just all changed, right?
It's so amazing.
Yeah.
And again, you are changing the narrative anytime someone steps up and they do something in such a unique way that has never been really done before in a big way.
Right.
They change the narrative, and you're changing the narrative when it comes to wilderness survival by, again, pointing to the fact that these things around us in the wilderness were given to us for a reason.
That's right.
So that we could, again, survive any situation we're placed into. Okay, but at the same time, you hold these camps. Tell me a little bit about Wild God and what all of this looks like.
Yeah, so there's really three aspects to my business now. Wild God Survival Courses, which is a 3-day immersive in the wilderness.
Okay.
No joke survival course.
So they're going to go out there.
We are out in a forest camp,
wow.
Kind of living off the land, learning shelter, water, traps, wild plants, the whole deal.
Wow.
But with a wild God theme, like, look at what God wove into this plant. Look at how God, everything is prefaced with, look at how God, look at the, look at what God did, look at God's just laughing right now. And so Wild God Survival Courses, we also host Wild God Events, which is a larger event, less survival, more immersed in creation, also learning some outdoor skills and survival skills, but more in like group workshop form. Okay. So a lot of praise and worship involved in all of those things, whether it's around the campfire, on a stage. And we're in the process of producing God in the Wild, a survival television show.
That's great.
So I've hosted several reality survival shows in the past for a variety of networks. And this will be my first foray into survival faith television. Yes. An unscripted survival journey with me and someone who has kind of backslidden in their faith. Mm-hmm. And we're going to do what God does, take them out into the wilderness and show them how awesome God is, and hopefully reacquaint them with their faith in the process.
I love that. I mean, I absolutely love that. There's been a few times throughout my life where, and I know one was in the Swiss Alps, when all of a sudden there was no one else in sight. Yeah. And I'm looking around and I'm seeing these majestic mountains all around me, and the snow-covered peaks, and a glacier coming over here, and all of a sudden everything just got so quiet. And just like Jesus in the wilderness, or just like when some of the prophets would go out, and you just feel so in tune, and you realize that this is all declaring God's glory. Yes. Just like we can declare God's glory, the stars are shouting out that, hey, I have a designer. Every plant is using photosynthesis from the sun to to transform that plant's life around to then give life-giving oxygen to us that are breathing it, right? And then you look at the mutualism and the symbiosis that we find all throughout nature. And you realize that this plant is dependent upon this insect, which is dependent upon that bird, which is dependent. Everything is connected together. And then you say, wait a second, but I'm dependent on that plant for my food. And so everything is this massive circle, and it's not a circle of life in a nature perspective of, well, this is just the way nature works. It is this finely tuned circle that points us right back to a grand designer. Okay, you have your family, River, has started a shorter series of kind of getting out into God's creation. In fact, it's how we were first acquainted.
That's right.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. So with my experience in television and his love for the outdoors, obviously, you know, we're outside a lot, and he loves the outdoors and loves rocks. You know, talking with you earlier about you hunting fossils and rocks as a 9-year-old boy, you know, reminds me of my son, River. And so we're always outside, and he loves sharing that with others.
That's great.
And so his YouTube channel is called Adventures of Riverhood.
Okay.
And he teaches outdoor skills to kids. Some survivally, but more about little critters and plants and just cool aspects of creation, but with a faith theme, you know. So it's important, you know, with everything we do in our family, whether it's our career, everything we do, we just try to do it for the glory of God. And, you know, that includes his little YouTube channel. You know, it's a form of, you know, little form of ministry for him as a young boy. And it's just me and him typically filming those.
That's great.
And so it's a great time just spending time with him in the outdoors, and which is where I believe little boys should be, right? Just out getting dirty and muddy and catching salamanders and, you know, digging things up and, you know, coming back filthy. So it checks a lot of boxes in our life right now.
Okay, and I love that you've mentioned that, because we have this culture that has said, okay, well, you're gonna be in a classroom for the majority of every day of your life until a certain age, and you know, when you get out of the classroom, then you're going to ride in a vehicle until you get back to your home, and then you're gonna walk into your home, and then you're gonna crank up your computer, and then you're gonna play a video game, and then you're gonna maybe do some homework sitting in your bedroom, and then you eat inside, and then you go to bed, and then that cycle repeats the next day for nearly every day of your youth. How important is it to get this next generation outside and to show them that God's creation is so much bigger than this little box that we've made for ourselves, for this little cultural, here's what we're supposed to do?
Well, it's terrifying. And especially coming full circle on this conversation, where I believe that the Lord designed the wilderness as a place for us to connect and spend time with him. And if there's one exclamation point on the end of this conversation, it's that we need to spend more time outside in the wilderness, especially kids. It is a place of wonder and learning, and most importantly, connecting with the Creator. Absolutely. And so it is probably the most important lesson I can teach as a wilderness survival instructor, is just the awe and wonder that comes along with studying creation.
Absolutely. And that's how you're changing the narrative. This morning I was preparing for filming with you today, and I was walking around the museum just outside, and out the front door I found this tiny, I mean, it had to be like 1.5 inches, 2 inches max across, snapping turtle, baby snapping turtle, that had somehow made its way up to the front door of the museum. I'm like, where did you? Well, we did have a lot of heavy rain and flooding last night. Well, just being able to take that and then go into the surrounding woods and go down to the nearest body of water, set it in the mud, you know, and then watch it crawl away. There's something fulfilling about that.
Yeah.
Creek Stewart.com. Is that right?
Yep. creekstewart.com and wildgod.org.
Wildgod.org. Yep. I would encourage everybody, get involved, maybe sign up for some of these courses. Yep. To be encouraged, to be inspired that there is a big world out there. And that big world is all pointing us right back to our designer, the God of the Bible, and ultimately to Jesus Christ, because we read that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, that Jesus was there in the beginning creating everything. And then he said, well, I want to have a relationship with you. I want you to be a part of my family because I've done all of this for you. I've given you this entire world to explore. And oftentimes we just don't give him glory for it. So thank you for giving him the glory for it. And also, maybe could you leave us with, in 30 seconds, one survival tip that you typically teach to audiences?
It's a great, I always come back to plants because I love plants. And almost every plant and tree has cordage built into the structure of the plant, whether it's the inner bark fibers of a basswood tree or the fibers of milkweed or stingy nettle. A lot of people don't know that linen comes from the flax plant. And so I love the idea that all the rope we could ever need comes right from plants and trees.
Wow. It's all right there.
It's all right there. Hidden.
Things that we use every day, it's hidden, but
that's right.
That is so incredible. Again, thank you for changing the narrative, for pointing to wilderness survival and how it all connects back with our daily life. And I look forward to really talking with you more about this in the future, and hopefully doing more together as we explore God's creation in great detail. And I want to thank you all for joining me on Changing the Narrative. Every day and every week, we are changing the narrative, and you have the ability to do that too. So I want you to get involved in what's going on. Share this message with your friends and family, with someone you know that might be skeptical, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm David Rives, and until next time, keep looking up. Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God. Find us on all social platforms to stay informed. Watch Genesis Science Network 24/7 for free on Roku, Fire TV, and on our website. Visit the world's largest origins-based store, creationsuperstore.com. Plan your trip to the Wonders Center and Science Museum just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Donate to our nonprofit ministry to help us continue sharing truth.